Moving into a new house is always a bit of an adventure, right? New spaces, new quirks to learn about, and for me, it came with the perfect setup for my work. I'm a graphic designer, which means I spend long hours hunched over a desk, staring at a screen and tuning out the world around me. The basement seemed like the ideal spot, a quiet, cozy corner where I could focus without distractions. When I moved in, the basement was half finished. Some old furniture, dusty boxes, and an odd assortment of things the previous owner had left behind. I didn't mind. It gave the place character. One of the first things I noticed was this tall antique mirror propped up against the wall. It was one of those heavy, old-fashioned mirrors with an ornate frame that looked like it had seen better days. The glass was a bit warped, giving reflections a strange, almost funhouse effect if you looked at it from certain angles. I figured I'd eventually get rid of it or move it somewhere else, but for now, it just sat there in the corner of my workspace, leaning against the wall like it owned the place. A few weeks in, I'd settled into a routine. I'd go down to the basement after dinner and work late into the night, chipping away at projects while the house was quiet. It became my zone, and I liked it that way. One night, though, things felt off. I was working on a deadline, and the clock had crept well past midnight. The only sounds were the hum of my computer and the faint creaks of the house settling. I'd become pretty desensitized to those sounds by then. Old houses have a language of their own, and you get used to the random pops and groans. But that night, I started hearing something else. At first, it was just a soft, shuffling noise like someone moving around on the other side of the basement. I looked up from my screen, listening intently, but the sound faded as quickly as it had come. I shrugged it off, figuring it was just the pipes or maybe a breeze slipping through a crack somewhere. But a few minutes later, it was back, this time more distinct. I looked around, peering into the dark corners of the basement. Everything was still. But then I caught sight of something in the mirror. Just a flicker, a brief movement behind me. I turned, expecting to see, I don't know, maybe a mouse or a shadow that had shifted. But there was nothing, just the empty basement. I looked back at the mirror, and there it was again. Something behind me, just out of focus. It was subtle, a dark shape that seemed to hover near the doorway, barely distinguishable. All right, I muttered to myself, trying to shake off the feeling creeping up my spine. I was tired, probably seeing things. I rubbed my eyes, took a deep breath, and tried to focus on my work. But the feeling wouldn't go away. I couldn't help looking up at the mirror every few minutes. Each time, I prepared myself to see that dark shape again, and each time, it seemed to linger a little longer, getting a little closer. A couple of nights later, it happened again. This time, I was so engrossed in my work that I didn't even notice it at first. But then I looked up, and there it was. A figure standing just behind me, close enough that I could almost feel its presence. I whipped around, my heart racing, but the basement was empty. Just the same dim light and the faint hum of my computer. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, maybe a reflection bouncing off something. But as I stared back at the mirror, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was there, lurking just out of sight. The next night, I was back at it, determined not to let my imagination get the best of me. I set up my workspace, turned on some music, and settled into my project. But an hour or so in, that uneasy feeling returned. I found myself looking over my shoulder every few minutes, expecting to see something. And then, as I looked up at the mirror, I saw it again, a figure standing directly behind me. This time, it was clearer, more defined. It was tall, shadowy, with no distinct features, just a dark outline that seemed to pulse with a strange energy. I didn't move, didn't even breathe. I just sat there, staring at it in the mirror, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It felt like an eternity, but in reality, it was probably only a few seconds. And then, just like that, it was gone. I jumped up, backed away from the mirror. I'd seen it, I knew I'd seen it, but there was nothing there. No sign of anyone or anything. The basement was as quiet and empty as ever. The following day, I decided to move the mirror. I'd had enough of its strange reflections and the unsettling feelings it seemed to stir up. I lifted it, planning to haul it upstairs, maybe even toss it out altogether. But as I moved it, something caught my eye, a faint handprint smudged on the glass, like someone had pressed their palm against it from the other side. I dropped the mirror, nearly tripping over myself as I backed away. The handprint was clear, and it seemed to be pressed into the glass, like it was trapped inside. After that night, I couldn't bring myself to set foot in the basement, much less work down there. Just the thought of sitting in that quiet, shadowy room with that mirror looming in the corner made my skin crawl. Instead, I moved my setup to the living room, hauling my laptop, papers, and supplies upstairs. I tried to focus on my work, to just brush off whatever had happened in the basement as some overactive imagination. But in the back of my mind, I kept wondering what I'd really seen, what had left that handprint. Every night, after the house settled into its usual quiet, I found myself staring at the basement door. I tried to convince myself that it was ridiculous, that I was overthinking things, but it didn't matter. Something about that space felt wrong, like it was better left alone. And each time I looked at that closed door, an uneasy feeling would settle over me, as if something was down there, waiting. Days passed like that, each one carrying a strange sense of anticipation. Finally, I realized I couldn't just leave the mirror down there. I had to get rid of it, even if it meant facing whatever feeling had sent me running from the basement in the first place. I knew I'd need help, though, so I called my friend Daniel and asked if he'd come over. I didn't go into too many details, just said there was a heavy mirror I wanted gone. When he arrived that evening, I took him down to the basement, doing my best to look casual, though my hands were shaking as I unlocked the door. Stepping inside, the room felt darker, colder than usual. The mirror was still propped against the wall, exactly where I'd left it, but now, in the dim light filtering from the staircase, I could see the faint handprint pressed against the glass, still visible. Daniel walked over and squinted at it. "That's weird. Are you sure it wasn't you?" I just shook my head. I couldn't bring myself to explain everything. "Let's just get it out of here." He shrugged, grabbing one side while I hesitantly took the other, keeping my eyes off the glass as much as possible. I didn't want to risk seeing that dark figure again, even as a reflection. We hauled the mirror up the stairs, its weight seeming heavier with every step. Once we made it outside, we carried it to the curb and left it there under the porch light, its ornate frame looking strangely out of place in the open air. I watched as the garbage truck came the next morning and hauled the mirror away. I felt a strange sense of relief, like a weight had been lifted. But that relief didn't last. Even now, sitting in the living room, working in what should feel like a safe space, I'm still on edge. I keep looking at my reflection in the windows, almost expecting to see that shadowy figure standing right behind me. And some nights, after I've turned off the lights and the house settles into silence, I swear I can hear a faint whisper from the basement. It's quiet, barely more than a murmur, but it's there, echoing up from below, as though the mirror left something behind, something that doesn't want to leave. I was fresh out of real estate school, just starting with the agency, so naturally they sent me to do a full inspection on this place. You know, one of those learning experiences. The property was a huge, old mansion tucked away in a high-end neighborhood, not exactly the kind of place you'd expect to be abandoned, but it had been on the market for years, collecting dust and rumors. There were stories from former tenants, strange noises, objects disappearing, the usual. I didn't believe any of that, of course. To me, it was just a dusty old house. This was one of those properties you only showed to the most curious clients because anyone seriously interested in moving in would balk at the scale of repairs it needed. It was run down but fascinating, and I often wondered why no one had taken it on yet. I'd visited a few times before with clients, but this time I was on my own, tasked with doing a full inspection to report back to the agency. We decided to give the listing one last push before considering other options, so I figured I'd make a day of it. I arrived just before noon, planning to cover the place top to bottom. Most of the house was what I expected: faded wallpaper in the grand foyer, cobwebs in the corners, rooms that felt drafty no matter how many windows you shut. The tour was going smoothly, at least at first. The main rooms carried that musty, old house smell. I took notes, snapped a few pictures, and marveled at the remnants of the once stylish decor. I saved the basement for last, thinking I'd wrap up there and head back to the office to prepare my report. The basement door creaked as I opened it, and I flipped on my flashlight, shining it down the stone step. They looked surprisingly sturdy given the age of the place. The main basement area was as expected: bare cement floors, exposed pipes, a few rusty shelves covered in dust. But as I turned to head back, something caught my eye. In the far corner, hidden behind some old crates, was another door, partially ajar. That was odd. None of the records mentioned a lower level, and I hadn't seen anything about an extra staircase. I stood there for a moment, weighing my options. Part of me wanted to turn back and write it off as an oddity, but the other part, the part that got me into real estate, was too intrigued to walk away. All right, I muttered to myself, guess I'll see what's down there. I started down the stairs, flashlight in hand. The air changed the moment I descended, becoming colder, and the walls seemed to close in, like the basement had shrunk around me. The only light was from my flashlight, illuminating just a few steps ahead. The descent seemed to take longer than it should have. Finally, I reached the bottom, and in the center of an otherwise empty room was a bed. Just a bare, metal-framed bed right in the middle of the floor. I stood there, staring. There were no windows, no furniture, nothing except that bed, which looked strange and out of place. I shook off the weird feeling creeping up on me. I'd seen abandoned properties with stranger things left behind, so I tried not to overthink it. I turned to go back up the stairs, ready to check this part off my list and move on. But as I reached the first step, I heard something. It was the unmistakable sound of footsteps above me, slow and steady, moving across the main basement floor. I froze, staring up the stairwell, listening. "Hello?" I called, expecting another agent to answer back. Maybe someone had dropped by to help. But there was no response, just the sound of footsteps pacing back and forth, until they stopped directly above me. Then, the door at the top of the stairs slammed shut, echoing through the small space. My flashlight flickered, and I nearly dropped it. Darkness pressed in around me, and for the first time, I felt a genuine sense of fear creeping in. I told myself not to panic. Maybe the door had closed on its own, maybe just a gust of air or something simple. But when I reached the top of the stairs and tried the handle, it wouldn't budge. The door was locked. "Hello?" I shouted, banging on the door. My voice sounded small. I took a shaky breath and tried the handle again, but it was like someone had locked it from the outside. Frustration and a growing sense of dread gnawed at me. I pulled out my phone and dialed the agency. My boss picked up, and I tried to keep my voice steady as I explained the situation. "Did anyone else come by the property?" I asked, trying to keep the desperation out of my voice. "No," my boss replied. "It's just you out there today. Is something wrong?" I hesitated, not wanting to sound paranoid. "I heard footsteps," I finally said, looking down the dim stairwell below me. "And the door locked behind me." My boss paused. "Hang tight. I'll call someone to come by and check it out." I thanked him and hung up, but the sense of isolation settled in. I was alone, locked in a dark basement with no explanation for the footsteps I'd heard. Then, as if things couldn't get worse, I heard the footsteps again, this time moving away from the door, back toward the main floor of the house. I backed away from the door, pressing my ear against the cold wall, straining to hear. The footsteps grew fainter, finally disappearing altogether. My mind raced through a dozen possibilities. Maybe it was a prank, or maybe a squatter had somehow been living in the basement. I shook my head, trying to clear the unsettling thoughts. This was just an old house, nothing more. Just then, my phone vibrated, breaking the silence. I answered immediately, almost sighing in relief when my boss said the police were on their way. I hung up and tried to steady my breathing, counting down the seconds until I'd be free of this place. A few minutes later, I heard the muffled voices of the officers above. They called out, and I shouted back, my voice echoing up the stairs. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the door opened, flooding the stairwell with light. One of the officers extended a hand, helping me up the stairs. I stumbled out, blinking in the brightness. They checked the basement but, of course, didn't find anyone. No signs of anyone else having been there, no explanation for the footsteps, nothing. One of the officers turned to me. "You're sure you heard someone?" "Absolutely," I said. There were footsteps, and the door locked behind me. The officer exchanged a look with his partner. "This house has been on the market for years," he said slowly. "We've had reports before. Noises, odd things. Sometimes these old houses attract unexpected visitors." "Like squatters?" I asked, hoping for any logical explanation. "Maybe," he replied. "We'll look into it, but if I were you, I'd be careful down there." They walked me to my car, and as I drove away, I couldn't shake the memory of those footsteps or the feeling that someone had been there with me. A week later, I got a call from my boss. They'd found out a bit more about the property. Apparently, a homeless man had been staying in the house periodically over the past year. It seemed he had a habit of sneaking into the basement, using the lower levels for shelter. "It must have been him," my boss said, as if that explained everything. But as much as I wanted to believe it, something about the experience didn't sit right. The man they described was old and frail. How could he have locked that door, moved so quietly? To this day, I don't go near that house alone. I've always felt uneasy about that small, low window in the basement. It sits nearly level with the ground, facing the backyard. Whenever I'm down there doing laundry, I find myself glancing up, half expecting to see someone watching me. Most of the time, it's just a quick look, and I tell myself it's all in my head, just my nerves playing tricks. But that window, it feels wrong, as if it's waiting for something. One night, after a long day at school with stacks of papers to grade, I headed to the basement to tackle some laundry. The house was silent except for the steady hum of the dryer in the corner. I was alone, and everything felt unusually still, as though the entire neighborhood had gone to bed. Outside, snow was falling softly, casting a faint glow through the window, reflecting off the fresh layer of snow blanketing the backyard. As I sorted clothes, I felt that familiar prickling sensation, the one that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand on end, like you're not truly alone. My back was to the window, and I didn't want to turn around, didn't want to validate that uneasy feeling. But of course, curiosity got the better of me. Telling myself it was just paranoia, I turned. There, pressed against the glass, was a face, pale, gaunt, almost ghostly, with wide, unblinking eyes staring straight at me. Whoever it was, they were completely still, their face so close to the glass I could see the fog from their breath forming on it. I froze, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. A flood of thoughts came rushing in. Was this some kind of sick prank? Had someone broken in? But those eyes, they were locked on me, and there was something in them that was too intense to be a joke. I didn't scream. Instead, I took a slow step back, hoping that maybe if I looked away, they'd disappear. But when I glanced back, they were still there, unmoving, unblinking. I grabbed my phone, called the police, keeping one eye on that haunting figure in the window. The operator told me to stay calm and assured me someone was on the way. Staying calm wasn't exactly easy, but I managed to keep my voice steady as I described what I was seeing. They promised help was coming, though the minutes felt like hours. Finally, I heard a car pull up outside. I ran upstairs, threw open the door, and signaled to the officers, explaining what I'd seen and pointing to the basement window. They didn't look overly surprised, just nodded and asked me to stay inside while they inspected the yard. A few minutes later, one officer knocked to inform me they hadn't found anything. No footprints in the snow, no signs of anyone having been near the house. The snow was pristine and undisturbed, smooth as if nobody had ever been there. I felt a mix of relief and frustration. Part of me wanted them to find something, anything, to validate what I'd seen. The officer suggested it was probably just a trick of the light or perhaps a reflection from something in the basement, trying to reassure me. But I could tell he thought I'd imagined it. After they left, I was left alone in the house, feeling more on edge than ever. That night, I barely slept. Every little creak in the house, every gust of wind rattling the windows, made me jump. I kept picturing that face in the window, those unblinking eyes. By morning, I convinced myself it had been exhaustion, maybe stress from work. But a few nights later, I was back in the basement, folding laundry, when that same prickling feeling returned, the sense of being watched. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the clothes in front of me, but then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move. Slowly, I glanced up at the window, nothing. Just darkness, with faint shadows from the yard lights cast across the snow. I sighed, relieved but embarrassed, thinking maybe I was getting paranoid. But as I turned back to my laundry, something compelled me to look over my shoulder once more. And that's when I saw it. The face was back, pressed right up against the glass, even closer this time, almost as if it was melting into it. This time, there was a faint, twisted smirk at the corners of its mouth. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the laundry basket, then bolted up the stairs, not daring to look back. 4 days, I couldn't bring myself to go back down there. I told a couple of friends about it, but they just laughed it off, saying it was probably a reflection, or maybe my imagination. But I knew what I'd seen, and the memory of that face, so close to the glass, haunted me. A week later, I had no choice but to go back to the basement, and every step felt like I was descending into a trap. I forced myself to keep my head down, focused on the laundry, refusing to look at the window. But no matter how hard I tried, I felt it, something watching me. Finally, I couldn't resist anymore. I glanced up, and there it was again. But this time, the face seemed even closer, almost as if it had pressed harder against the glass, merging with it. This time, the eyes weren't just staring, they were moving, following my every step. I backed up, then turned and sprinted up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind me. That night, I dragged a heavy armchair in front of the door, hoping it would keep whatever was down there from getting any closer. Desperate for some proof, I decided to set up a camera facing the window, hoping to catch something that would validate my experience. The next day, I reviewed the footage, expecting to see nothing. But around midnight, the camera picked up a shape, a faint blur moving outside the window. It was hard to make out, just a shadow passing by. But then, for a brief second, the camera captured a face pressed against the glass, staring directly into the lens. I haven't been back to the basement since. I don't know what it is, or what it wants, but sometimes, when I'm lying in bed, I can almost feel those eyes watching, waiting for me to come back down. Since the police couldn't help with whatever's in my home, I'm considering calling a priest, hoping maybe a blessing might bring some peace. It may sound excessive, maybe even foolish, but after what I've seen, I'm willing to try anything to feel normal here again. I recently moved into a rental house, and at first, everything seemed ideal. It was small, cozy, in a quiet neighborhood, the kind of place I'd pictured ever since I left my last apartment. Working as a daycare teacher, I really value my quiet time, and the thought of a peaceful escape from the daily sounds of kids playing and screaming felt like a dream. This house, with its neat little backyard and a big basement perfect for storage, felt like the perfect retreat. The basement, though, gave me a bit of an uneasy feeling from the start. It had that unmistakable musty smell that old basements seem to carry, and the single light bulb hanging from the ceiling cast a strange, eerie glow. Still, I brushed it off, thinking that's just how basements are. With so many boxes still unpacked, I found myself going down there a lot, especially during those first few days. The first time I heard the crying, it was faint, almost like it was coming from outside. I was in the kitchen putting groceries away when I heard a soft, muffled sound, barely noticeable. It was just enough to make me stop and listen. It sounded like a child crying, but I didn't think much of it, assuming it was just some kid from the neighborhood. I went back to what I was doing. The next day, while sorting some things in the basement, I heard it again. This time, it was louder and seemed to be coming from nearby, almost echoing through the walls. I froze, standing still, straining to listen. It wasn't just crying, it was a kind of crying that sounded sad, almost desperate. I felt this uncomfortable pull, like I should be doing something, as if I were hearing one of the kids at work in distress. I couldn't just ignore it. I made my way up the stairs, opened the basement door, and listened, trying to figure out if the sound was coming from outside. But as soon as I reached the main floor, the crying stopped. The silence was so complete it almost startled me. I shrugged it off, blaming it on weird neighborhood noises. Maybe the basement was amplifying the sound in some strange way. A few nights later, I was sitting on the couch reading, and the crying started again. It was late, close to midnight, and this time there was no mistaking it. I could hear it so clearly, soft, heart-wrenching sobs, like a young child crying nearby. This time, it sounded even closer, almost as if it were coming from right behind the basement door. I put down my book, feeling a bit rattled. My mind started coming up with logical explanations. Maybe there was a house nearby where a child was crying, and somehow the sound was traveling through the walls. But it was so quiet outside, I couldn't hear anything else, no voices, no cars, just those desperate, soft sobs. I took a deep breath and approached the basement door. I pressed my ear against it, listening closely. The crying was louder now, almost as if it were just on the other side. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, but it was just a kid, right? Maybe there was an open window down there, and the sound was coming from outside. Slowly, I opened the door and flipped on the basement light, squinting as I peered down the stairs. I could still hear the crying, but it didn't seem to have a clear source. It was as if the sound was floating in the air, surrounding me. With a shaky breath, I headed down the stairs, each step creaking louder than the last. When I reached the bottom, I looked around, expecting to see someone. But the basement was empty, shadows long and dark. The crying faded as I stood there, almost as if it stopped the moment I arrived. I waited a few moments, listening, but only silence greeted me. Feeling uneasy, I went back upstairs, telling myself I was just tired, maybe imagining things. For the next few days, I tried to forget about it. I went to work, came home, tried to stick to my routine as if nothing strange had happened. But I couldn't completely relax. Every time I was home, I found myself listening, waiting for that pitiful crying to start up again. And sure enough, a week later, I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of soft sobs drifting up from the basement like a whisper. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, heart racing, wondering if I should go down there. But it was the middle of the night, and the thought of going down into the basement alone in the dark made my stomach twist. By morning, I was frustrated and a bit unnerved. I called my landlord, an older man who had been friendly enough when I first moved in. I asked him if there was any history to the house, anything that could explain what I was hearing. He was quiet for a moment before letting out a long sigh. "You're not the first to mention it," he finally said. "The last tenants, a young couple, they moved out after a few months. They said they couldn't stand the crying, kept thinking it was some child trapped in the basement. But we checked, and there was nothing there." His words sent a chill down my spine. I tried to keep my voice steady as I asked, "Did they ever figure out what it was?" He hesitated. "They thought it might be something to do with the foundation or the acoustics of the place. But who knows? Some folks think old houses hold on to memories." I hung up feeling even more disturbed. Memories? I didn't believe in ghosts or hauntings, but the idea of some kind of lingering sound in the basement was unnerving. That night, I stayed up late, determined to find the source of the crying. I left the basement door open and sat at the top of the stairs, phone in hand, ready to record if I heard it again. Hours passed, and just as I was beginning to think it wouldn't happen, the sound started. Soft, muffled, a child's voice rising up from the darkness. I hit record and listened, heart pounding. The crying sounded different this time, more urgent, like the child was in real distress. I called out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" The crying stopped, replaced by a silence so thick it felt oppressive. I waited, holding my breath, until finally I couldn't take it anymore. I went down the stairs, gripping my phone tightly, its faint light barely enough to see by. The sobs had been so clear, they couldn't be coming from outside. It was as if they were coming from right within these walls. When I reached the bottom, the crying started up again, softer this time, almost like a whisper. I shined my phone's light around, the shadows dancing as I moved, but there was nothing there, just the faint smell of damp cement and an overwhelming sense of sadness filling the room. I was about to head back upstairs when I noticed something, a small dark patch on one of the walls next to the foundation. It looked like water damage, a stain I hadn't noticed before. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't water, it was darker, like a shadow or something else. I reached out, fingers brushing against the cold wall, and for a second, I could have sworn I heard a faint whisper. My blood went cold. I stumbled back, heart racing, and practically flew up the stairs. I slammed the basement door shut, breathing heavily. I didn't sleep that night, too rattled to close my eyes. The next day, I started looking for a new place. I didn't care about breaking the lease or the hassle of moving again. I just couldn't stay in that house, not with whatever was in the basement. Within a week, I was gone, my things packed, my mind haunted by that faint whisper. To this day, sometimes I still think I can hear it, that desperate, pleading cry. I don't know what it was or if anyone else will hear it, but one thing is certain. I'll never step foot in that basement again. If these basement tales had you double-checking your locks, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more spine-tingling stories. Have your own creepy basement experience? Share it in the comments. I'd love to hear all the eerie details. And remember, next time you head down to the basement, maybe keep a light on. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.